Hello, everybody. We're excited to have you join us today for our live webinar on network supply chain challenges. Before we dive in, my name is Morgan Stern. I'm the VP of Automation Strategy at Itential, and I'm joined today by Karan Munalingal, Head of Solutions Engineering here at Itential. Hi, Karan.
Hey, Morgan. Hello, everyone. Karan Munalingal here. Super excited to partner with Morgan to talk about, how network automation orchestration can help mitigate some of the supply chain challenges and, the organizations are facing today. So super excited. Thanks, Morgan.
Thank you, Karan. During today's webinar, we'll be having a discussion about the impact of the recent supply chain issues in the network industry, and we'll provide some strategies on how to mitigate those risks. Karan's going to demonstrate some of those strategies in action. If you have questions, please ask them along the way and we'll answer them, either during the session or after as a follow-up. With that said, let's get started. At Itential, we work with a number of service providers and enterprises as they are deploying their network infrastructures. In a lot of cases, these automation and orchestration initiatives are in support of larger strategic initiatives like data center builds, 5G deployment, edge computing, things like that. We've heard firsthand about the challenges that these teams are having while they're trying to procure network gear for those priority projects. And we're working with some of them to keep those projects on track. When we took a look at the networking industry overall in preparation for this session, we found some really interesting statistics. The supply chain crunch is hitting the industry hard, both in terms of lead time to receive products and in price increases for critical components. In some extreme cases, the people we've been working with are looking at delays of up to 18 months to receive new networking equipment. Anecdotally, we're hearing about major delays in areas like data center switching and edge network devices. And these were already both in high demand prior to the supply chain crunch because of the critical role that they're playing in cloud initiatives. So this supply chain crunch, it's impacting teams in multiple ways. The most obvious being increased costs, shipping delays, and extremely limited availability of key components. These factors are causing delays in the project plans for multiple initiatives. In the past, some teams have been successful with a two-vendor approach. The operational trade-offs for having multiple vendors were offset by improved bargaining power and an alternative supplier in the event that one of the vendors was late with a new product release or due to manufacturing delays. Unfortunately, given the global nature of the supply chain crunch, at the component level, it seems like almost all of the vendors have been impacted. So the dual vendor strategy hasn't been sufficient to mitigate those kinds of delays. So for the most part, teams have been stuck with their current vendors because historically it was too expensive and time consuming to bring in a new vendor, even if they had products available during the delay from the primary guys. And what we saw was the cost and complexity was falling into one or more of four categories. First was around integration and testing of the new vendors. Next was around the impact to the IT systems for bringing in a new vendor. Third was around engineering expertise. It takes time and money and energy to either train up the folks in the new vendor technology or to hire new people. And the fourth was around organizational competence, meaning all of the stakeholders that needed to support that additional vendor. And Karan will talk about some of that in a couple of minutes. So for the networking teams that are impacted by these supply chain issues, we think there's a new option. Previously, there was only two. They could either wait for the suppliers to come through with the products and try to prioritize by directing that supply to their key initiatives, or they could spend the time and money to test, integrate, support the new vendor, meaning they needed to develop that competency with their subject matter expertise and across their organization. And they needed to do a lot of testing to ensure that the alternative product would be a suitable option and to be able to work in their environment. Now we've been finding there's a third option, and we've seen multiple Itential customers implement this option with really good outcomes. With this option, the teams are using automation to mitigate a lot of the challenges we talked about earlier. So let's talk about how we're doing this. First, for integration and testing, Teams are using Itential's rapid integration capabilities to quickly connect with new systems and device types. They're leveraging community assets like Ansible playbooks and scripts by onboarding those assets onto the Itential automation gateway and incorporating them into larger automations. Additionally, they're using the capabilities of the platform to create test automation workflows. So all of that testing that they would have been performing manually in the past, they can do that in an automated fashion. For the IT system impact, users are leveraging Itential's adapter builder and real-time integration capability to incorporate new systems into the automations. They're also using data transformations to automate the translation of data between systems. For the engineering skills, teams are learning that they can rely on a smaller set of subject matter experts if they embed the engineering expertise into the automations. This applies to things like vendor-specific processes or configurations, as well as to the creation and enforcement of things like golden configuration. So what they're seeing is by embedding all of that expertise into the automations, they're able to get better mileage out of a smaller set of subject matter experts. For organizational competence, by incorporating a comprehensive automation framework, stakeholders outside of the network team can have a consistent and predictable process for providing inputs and getting what they need out of their portion of the activity. Now I'm going to hand things over to Karan, who will talk about the approach in more detail and will demonstrate some of these techniques. Karan, take it away.
Thank you, Morgan. Before we jump into the demonstration, based on Morgan's last discussion of the last slide, right now we have options. And the third option mentioned there was leveraging automation. And when we talk to organizations that are facing this issue around supply chain, and it's great to hear that the option around automation is enticing. So the first thing they do as well, if I go with a brand new vendor as part of this strategy, I have to onboard those network assets within my ecosystem so they become usable, alongside your existing vendor that you have in place. But when you think about device onboarding, it goes beyond just the execution, right? When you talk to NetOps teams, they're focused on, hey, yes, bring on the brand new vendor, and I can focus on creating templates and apply the day one, day two configurations and address that. And now the device is up and running. But you have to remember, there's a lot more that needs to happen before you can do that within the network, right? Every organization that is approaching and taking this strategy has to do a lot of prep work upfront, and that requires, procurement, resource assignments, notifying all the teams that are going to be involved as part of this onboarding activity. At the same time, you're doing a lot of pre-execution steps, such as approving some of the golden configuration that would be applied to the new vendor, the switches that are coming from the new vendor that are going to be onboarded and made available as part of the network, right? As part of that, you're also trying to figure out who's going to be responsible for the change request management, who is going to be approving some of these incoming assets and configs that go on these devices, pre-checks, post-checks, etc. And then you do the execution. Follow on from the execution, it becomes very critical that all your IT systems and inventory systems and resource management systems are properly and appropriately updated, so the entire organization knows that there is a new vendor and a new set of capabilities made available, so you can use that for providing services over the top, right? So then we kind of go into some of the post checks and monitoring those new assets that have come into play as part of your servicing strategy, right? So there's a lot that goes on purely as part of the device onboarding process in general. But when you take a look at this content here, you'll also notice the same could be applicable to some of the day two and day n changes, right? Whether you're modifying VERFs on a device, whether you're upgrading a device, the same concept has to be comes to life, where you are doing prep work, where you are doing pre-execution, and you have to perform some sort of follow-up tasks to address this end-to-end comprehensive automation and orchestration that's going to drive down the errors that you're getting in the network, but also making sure that the onboarding as well as the consumption of your new vendor's technology is effective and more robust. right? So with that, what I'm going to do is quickly talk about two parts of the demos that we're going to show today, right? So the first part of the demonstration is going to focus on onboarding the new vendor, right? So as you see on the right-hand side, there's a quick demo architecture that focuses on which sources of truth we're going to integrate into, right? In this case, it's going to be NetBox and Gitlab, right? Those are our two sources of truth. For change management, we're going to be integrating with ServiceNow. And then from a multi-vendor perspective, the two that we have chosen for part of this demonstration is Cisco and Arista. But as Morgan mentioned, right, our goal is to provide tools and technologies so you could not only go beyond these two vendors. In the future, you can think about potentially having a multi-vendor strategy instead of consolidating to a single vendor, right? The goal is to help customers onboard and potentially decommission some of the vendors from the network as the strategy prevails. And finally, from a steps perspective, we're going to focus highly on some of the pre-checks and the post-checks as part of this, because you have to make sure when you're onboarding a new vendor or even managing assets from existing vendor, how do you apply some of the guardrails, some of the golden configuration guardrails that you have in place from a network engineering aspect, and make sure that your network is service ready at all times, right? And finally, notification, which is a very critical piece. As you have more folks involved as part of not only device onboarding, but some of the other day two operational activity, we want to make sure that we're leveraging integrations into these notification systems, whether it's MS Teams or Slack or Ops Genie, to make sure everyone is on the same page with respect to where the onboarding process is and whether the device is now available for consumption or not. So that's the first part of the demonstration that we're going to be focused on. For the second part of the demonstration, once we onboard that new Arista switch within our data center, the goal is to rapidly leverage a several set of pre-built automations, whether it's integrating into your Teams or NetBox or ServiceNow. We'll just reshuffle and piece the puzzle together to actually provide some of the day two and day end provisioning activities as well, right? You'll notice it's the same set of integrations that we have. And the reason for that is what we're doing here as part of the demonstration, but also a strategy, is to create a framework around technologies in your ecosystem. So that way, when you're onboarding a new vendor's switch or a router or firewall, you're not impacting your overall process, right? Let's move away from deconstructing and reconstructing your entire end-to-end orchestration, but rather focus on some of the modular pieces so you can plug in and plug out some of these new vendors that organizations are pursuing, right? So with that, what we're going to do is jump right into the platform and talk about how Itential helps our customers do this today out of box. All right, so what you're looking at now is the Itential automation platform. On the left-hand side, there are a certain set of applications that we're going to dive into today in support of the demonstration that shows how organizations can easily mitigate from some of the supply chain challenges, but also some of the choices that they make to move from one vendor to another, or even have multiple vendors within their network, right? So first, we're going to focus on the Automation Studio. That's where you actually build your pre-built, leverage your pre-built automations, but also build some of the business logic and integration into your third-party system to create that orchestration that covers your 90 to 100% of activities required to do this correctly, right? Then we're going to focus on Configuration Manager, right? Morgan hit on how do we leverage the tribal knowledge that we have from our engineers that they might be SMEs on certain products provided by certain vendors. So how do we leverage their knowledge in that space for that specific vendor and incorporate that in building some of the network engineering rules and policies within the golden config application? And finally, Operations Manager. This is where we expose some of these automations so network engineers and ops engineers can use that in order to onboard some of these newer devices, but also perform some of the day end, right? Day 2+ operations on top of some of the newly available resources in your network. All right, so let's quickly get started with the Automation Studio. What we're going to go take a look at is the onboarding flow that we're going to kick off today via the Operations Manager from a self-service portal, right? So when I click into it, well, what you'll see is in the middle, it's the automation canvas. And, this is a orchestration, right? This is touching a lot of different systems as part of this device onboarding flow. But from left to right, let's quickly take a look at what this entails. So when I quickly zoom into it, the first part of the automation focuses on, working with your ITSM system with respect to change management. Doesn't matter if you're doing a device onboarding or a VERF configuration later on this device, you want to make sure that you have your change management intact, right? So this way, this is a modular automation. It's a pre-built automation that Itential provides that every customer can use as part of their orchestrated flow to quickly interface and interact with ServiceNow and create change requests, seek for approval, etc. Right? Moving to the right, that kind of parlays into how do we leverage your existing ticketing system so we're opening correct tickets for the right team with respect to approvals, or even just for auditing purposes over time on how many devices came through the onboarding process, which ones are available, etc. Right? Now you get to keep tabs on that in a programmatic fashion. So you'll notice these are purple boxes and they represent modular automations that you can stitch together to attain your end goal around orchestrating some of these automations. The next part of the automation that you see here focuses on adding a device to Itential's automation gateway. Automation gateway is something that Itential leverages in order to communicate with these vendor-specific switches and devices, anything that is CLI operated, right? That's where automation gateway comes into picture. So as part of this orchestrated flow, we're actually going to add this device within automation gateway. At the same time, we're also going to add it to NetBox as a source of truth / inventory, right? A lot of organizations have NetBox, CMDB, etc. We want to make sure that as part of this orchestrated and automated process, we're able to add these programmatically so humans don't have to swivel chair across these systems as newer and newer devices come on board, especially it's happening at scale, right? So once we add the devices to the relevant system, then we have the next step where we are, setting up the device. What that means is we're actually leveraging two different sources of truth here that we're integrating with, namely NetBox and Gitlab, to actually fetch relevant information, whether it's site information, where the device is coming up, whether it's device-specific role information, such as, if it's an access switch, these are the interfaces we need to create, etc. Right? So in this point, Itential will be integrating with NetBox, where we're leveraging our API capability to pull information specific to sites. So as part of this automation today, we're going to be adding a brand new Arista switch to Tampa, right? That's a site. So when I click into this, there's a set of information that's available around VLAN and NTP server that we're going to be pulling, leveraging APIs, and use that as part of our golden config compliance so we can remediate those set of configuration on those devices. At the same time, part of the relevant information for this upcoming device is also stored within Gitlab. A lot of organizations are now leveraging infrastructure as code mentality to move forward with respect to automating more and more of these device-specific configuration, right? So you will notice, in addition to us going to NetBox to pull some of the relevant day 0, day 1 configuration, we're also going to be integrating into GitLab via APIs to pull day 1 config data, such as some of the OSPF or interface information that are going to be leveraged to dynamically generate the config that's going to go on these upcoming devices within our network. Going back to the automation flow here, you'll notice after we're done with gathering all the information from various different sources of truth, what we do is we have some of the evals here, right? Whether you want to have an approval step where your ops engineer gets involved and says, yes, I approve of this, let's move forward. Or you can bypass that as part of your, zero touch onboarding process and move forward with applying the golden configuration, right? So in this stage, as we talked about early on, you talk about network or vendor specific automations and non-vendor specific. All the things that we have done pre the golden config step would now be part of a framework that organizations can use to easily onboard a new vendor. What that means is this specific pre-built automation or the modular automation will focus on doing something that is Arista specific. So let's quickly talk about what that looks like. So as a network engineer, I can bring in my tribal knowledge about Arista and define a golden config tree using the configuration manager application. So let's quickly go into the configuration manager application, where you will notice in first glance, these are all the devices that we federate across different technologies, right? You'll notice there's existing Cisco switches, there's NX, there's F5, etc. What we will do as part of this demonstration is onboard a brand new Arista switch. And when we do that, it will automatically appear here, and we'll be able to do operations such as get live configuration from the device, or get live configuration from look at backups of those devices as well. At the same time, going back to our conversation around how can a network engineer participate as part of this process. So when we go into the golden config sub application here, let's look for EOS, right? This is a golden configuration tree that your network engineer can build with respect to, what are my sites look like, right? What is the role of this particular device? Where is it coming up, right? This is a configurable tree. For for the purpose of this demonstration, we have created a tree that is based on, countries as well as sites. So let's look at Tampa, right? So when I click into the Tampa node, you'll notice as part of the configuration, we inherit everything from top to bottom. So anything that is globally defined within base will be inherited for all the devices that get associated with the Tampa site. And within the Tampa site, you'll notice as a network engineer, you get to define, hey, I want to put a default switch port config on here, right? I actually want to configure NTP servers. And you'll notice within the context here, these are all variables being defined. So it's not static configuration that your network engineers are, creating multiple templates for. This is a reusable golden configuration standard where these variables are actually coming from different sources of truth. So as we discussed as part of our automation early on, you'll notice these are some of the parameters that we're real-time pulling from NetBox. At the same time, there are other variables that are defined in here specifically within the interface. These are actually going to be coming from our Gitlab repository, right? So you notice the trend here is keeping that abstracted. Your network engineers can now focus on designing a similar golden configuration template for any new vendor that is up and coming in your network without having to, worry about, hey, do I need to go now repurpose and remodify my source of truth, right? NetBox is going to still continue providing the IP addresses for the new switch that you're bringing on. Your repository are still going to have some device-specific information that is guided and being built by some of the other ops engineer in your network, right? So this is how multiple folks can participate as part of your automation strategy without having to refactor the entire flow. So going back to our automation, within this modular step, we would be invoking that golden configuration that your network engineers have built. And then once it's applied, we're actually going to start updating the tickets every single time we make a change within the network. So that gives you audit history on what's actually happening on the network assets. So at this point, you'll notice there's a fork. Sometimes customers like to provision both day one and day two configuration as part of their automated flows. In this example, we're going to bypass day two because as second part of the demonstration, we also want to showcase how customers, once the device is service ready, it's consumable by your internal consumers and external consumers to put things like VRF config on it or interface config like port turnup as an example, right? So that's a second part of the demo, which will focus on that. So moving further to the right, you'll notice after we're done with actually applying the day one configuration, we're now updating the CR change request within ServiceNow. At the same time, we're transitioning Jira tickets to done, right? These are all part of your end-to-end process where someone has to log into several different systems. But in this case, we're doing that programmatically using APIs. And finally, if you look to the right-hand side of this manual reset demo step, the focus is around decommissioning a device. Let's say the onboarding was not up to par and you wanted to undo everything. What this part of this automation orchestration does is it will remove the device from automation gateway. It will remove the device from your inventory, in this case, NetBox. It will, all the resources that were, all the resources within NetBox and Gitlab that was subscribed for this potential and particular device will be released. So they're now available for the next set of devices. And finally, once that is done, we're basically updating the CR again, and then closing it out closing out the CR, right? So you'll imagine, you can imagine, I know this decommissioning set of steps are part of this onboarding process, but a lot of our customers will now make this into a reusable automation. And at any point, if you're moving from, let's say, Cisco to Arista or Cisco to Juniper, et cetera, and you're decommissioning the former vendor, you can now use this set of steps in order to do that at scale without having to re-invoke all the other steps as part of the device onboarding. You can call it a device decommissioning automation that could be invoked, right? So with that, what we're going to do is we are now going to the Operations Manager application. This is a self-service portal that's available within Itential, where based on your role within the organization, when you log in, you might see all the network as a service capability available on the left-hand side. Specifically for this webinar, what we're going to do for this demonstration, let's look for onboarding, right? So there are two available. Let's pick the multi-vendor. You'll notice, because I'm an admin on the platform, I have the ability to see all the automation. But from an ops engineer perspective or a network engineer perspective, you can restrict which specific automations they can kick off from within Itential or from outside of Itential. So let's kick one off from here. So when I click the play button here on the right-hand side, you'll notice we are displaying a form that someone can fill out when you're onboarding a brand new vendor. In this case, the new manufacturer, before you had Cisco, now you're going with Arista as a second vendor in your network. And then EOS, this is automatically chosen. From a naming perspective, because this is coming up in Tampa, let's add TAM to the name of the device. And this is a public IP available, the role of the device and the tree that you want it associated with it, right? And the specific region that this device is coming up in. These are all the levers that your engineer can pull when making a decision where this device is coming up, or you can have some business rules within your automation, so it self-selects, and all the user has to do is say, this is me, this is the initial temporary IP address for that device, and this is the name. And then based on where the switch is coming out, where it's plugged in, the automation can self-associate that with a specific golden configuration tree as it's doing so, right? So as part of this automation, we're not going to auto-approve because we want to actually stop within the automation to enable an ops engineer to take the next step, right? So that way, as organizations are getting comfortable with automations, they can actually put that approval step, and over time, they can remove that, right? So we'll do that as part of this demonstration. So let's kick it off on this manually. And as you can see, it brings us to this canvas here. So as soon as I submitted the request to go automate, what it's doing right now, it has successfully done the first part of this automation. And you'll notice this is a list that you see here. These are all the steps that are being performed in an automated fashion. More interestingly, if you look at the canvas here, and I quickly kind of zoom in, we have done the snow request. We have created a ServiceNow change request automatically. We have created a Jira ticket and transitioned that into in progress state, right? So as these things are happening, we're also notifying individuals that need to be notified. So if I go into the MS Teams visual here, you'll notice there is a brand new device onboarding request. There's an associated Itential job link. There's a ServiceNow link, and there is a Jira ticket link, right? So this now gives a very quick way for your engineers to say, hey, someone initiated onboarding of a new device. What is that all about? So when they click on this link, it actually takes them to a ServiceNow screen and tells them about the change request and what is being added to the network, right? Going back to the automation itself, let's take a look at what step it's waiting on right now. So as we kind of go through and we have successfully added the device within the automation gateway, right? So if you look at the automation gateway, which is also an Itential application, we'll go take a look at the inventory. So as you noticed before, we did not have the DC TAM device, right? So if we go take a look at the device, you'll notice it's now successfully added here, right? And these are some of the associated inventory information. At the same time, we have also added that device within NetBox, right, as a source of truth. So you'll notice we have successfully gone and accessed NetBox via APIs, gathered the next available IP address available for the interfaces, and added the device as part of the device list here. So that way, as you can see, that the goal is leveraging automation to not only onboard the device from a configuration perspective, but also update all the relevant systems in your environment to make sure that everyone knows that there's a new device now available, right? So going back to the automation flow here, we have passed through setting up the actual device. And as we discussed in the previous part of the conversation, in this step, we're actually accessing NetBox and Gitlab to get all the variables. So when I click on this query, right, when we go talk to third-party systems such as NetBox and Gitlab through APIs, we get some responses back. But we only need specific set of information from those responses so we can use that for our golden configuration. So when I click on this query on the right-hand side, you'll notice this was some of the data federated using the API, right? But what does the outgoing look like? You'll notice as part of the file content, we have successfully pulled all the OSPF and the interface variables that would be required for our golden config. And finally, all the parameters from NetBox. So this now enables us to plug the values that we're fetching real time from these systems into the golden configuration that our network engineer has built for the Arista switches, right? Which is a brand new vendor in your environment. So now the automation is currently waiting at a manual step, which is assigned to a network engineer. So you'll notice at this step, I can take an action. So when I click on the work button, I have the ability to move the automation forward. Just like I'm able to do this within Itential, we could have also, as part of this end-to-end automation, created a ServiceNow approval step. So this could now happen outside of Itential where someone is approving the automation to move forward. All right, so let's go ahead and continue. And once we continue, you'll notice this is going to continue moving forward. We have successfully completed that step. And if we zoom out slightly, it's currently pushing configuration onto the device using our config manager application. So what we'll do at the end of this automation, when it stops here, is we will go into config manager and see if the device has been successfully onboarded and what do the backups look like, right? The before and the after. So as it kind of traverses this pre-built modular automation, it's also going to complete some of the things around updating the ticket. So if we go back to this specific ticket within, or the change request within ServiceNow, and if I refresh it, you'll notice as we're kind of going through, let's take a look at the notes. So you'll notice device, the day 0 has been pushed. We're currently adding golden configuration. So as we're going through the motion as part of our automated workflow, we're also updating ServiceNow. So someone can come in here and take a look at, what step is this specific automation on. So let's quickly go back to the operations manager screen. And wait until we kind of go through this motion of applying the golden configuration to the device. So While this is happening in the background around us pushing the day one configuration, part of the flow that you see here is to also make sure that when the devices actually come up, they would show up here, right? So as first part of the demonstration, as I was just kind of walking through these applications here, let me quickly go into the devices. Let's click refresh here. And you'll notice there is a brand new device that has been added successfully to the Itential automation platform, right? We are federating this because this device was successfully added to the automation gateway. It will just show up here, right? It's dynamic in nature. So when I click on it, you'll notice I have the ability to load live configuration on this device. As part of the automation, we also make sure that we are checking connectivity, because if the connectivity does not exist, we can't push any config. So at this point, you'll notice as part of our golden config standard that the network engineers have designed, we have successfully pushed the NTP servers. We have successfully pushed some of the interfaces that were defined as part of our standards. And when we go take a look at the backups, right, you'll notice these backups were actually programmatically done as part of that workflow that you saw early on, right? So let's go take a look at before the remediation. What did it look like and what did it look like against a live config? So when I load the diff between the two, you'll notice what you see on the left was a backup before, and what's on the right is after we remediated using the golden configuration standards that your engineers have defined, right? We have way more NTP servers. We have additional VLANs that were added, and all the interfaces are going to be used for the specific VLANs, right? So at this point in time, what we have done is we have successfully onboarded a device within Itential using automation. This is your brand new vendor, brand new switch. Now that the device has been successfully onboarded with day one configuration, what we're going to also show you as part of this demonstration is how rapidly organizations can now use this device that came up with the right standards as part of their services, right? So going back to the list of automations that have been exposed, we also have another automation that we have created to push VRF configuration on this device. So let's go take a look at that, right? Because now the device is up and running very rapidly, we can now enable somebody else to say, hey, just like you were pushing VRF configuration to your Cisco switches, now you can do that on your Arista switches. So very similar to the device onboarding self-service item, now we're looking at a day 2 or a day N operation where I'm just trying to create a VRF and associate that with the interface. So when I click trigger, you'll notice on the right-hand side, there is a form now available. Very easy for someone to fill out where they're not having to do ticket creation, etc. Right? So from a device name perspective, if I look for DC, there you go. Now you have that brand new device available, and I can now create a brand new VLAN on it, right? As part of the end-to-end automation, think about the same framework that we can use integrating into ServiceNow, into Jira, into NetBox, and finally closing the tickets out across the board. We can now use that same concept for your day 2 activities against your Arista switch. So what we're going to do is we're going to quickly go ahead and kick this thing off and watch within the operations manager how we kind of proceed through this motion. So this is another higher level automations that we have built. And you'll notice is the same set of pre-built modular automations that we're consistently using across every single use case. So because we have built it in a modular fashion, it's very easy for engineers to stitch these together in order to help drive value rapidly, right? So you'll notice even for this VRF automation, we're creating a CR within ServiceNow. We're broadcasting notification. So if I go back to our Microsoft Teams here, the first time we did it, it was a device onboarding request. The second time we kicked it off, it's an Arista VRF automation request, right? So I can do the same thing. This notification could now go to a completely different team who cares about, VRF being added to devices from a service perspective, right? So when I click on this ticket, it's a very similar view within Snow. where it kind of gives you what someone is trying to do. So the description says someone is trying to add VLAN 603 with this network address to that brand new switch that was onboarded, right? And then as part of the automation process, someone can follow the notes on what's actually happening within the end-to-end flow. So going back here right now, it's focused on this specific child automation or modular automation. As I mentioned early on, organizations can define what is network or vendor specific and identify things that are not vendor specific and should happen as part of your end-to-end process anyways. And once you have defined a framework like this, all you have to do is expose, something like Automation Studio to your SMEs that know about Cisco, Juniper, Arista, and they can design and define this specific automation and just plug it in. So as part of this, exercise, let's go take a look at what that specific automation looks like. And you'll notice right now, as an engineer for Arista, I've created a pre-check. I have where I push the VRF configuration, and I'm going to do a post check, right? Very common. So instead of focusing on an entire end-to-end process, all they had to do is bring their tribal knowledge and create something very small like this, right? So as part of the pre-check, we do have a manual step. So when we go take a look into it, you'll notice it's currently waiting for someone to review the results of pre-checks and move this thing forward. So when I go take a look at that, it's going to tell me that I ran a couple of commands, whether they're a pass or fail, and then we're going to move the automation forward. As you notice, as part of an automation, you also want to make sure that you build in a lot of fallouts, right? So in this case, the fallout is someone wanted to review the data. So we're going to add a manual task in here. But if it was a zero touch, it would just move forward. All right. So now that we have an opportunity to take a look at the results coming back, you'll notice we successfully ran the show running config, specifically looking for VLANs and the section interfaces, and it's passed. So I'm going to go ahead and click success. It's going to move the automation forward. So if we go back here, it's actually going to start configuring the VRF on the device and then move forward to performing the post checks, right? So if we go all the way back, it's currently still in the same process, because what customers usually do is they will embed some of these manual checks around pre and post to make sure that the engineers are still getting comfortable with the idea of automation around the network. But over time, as I mentioned, they get more comfortable. They're looking at the same set of data, so they'll make it more automated and only include the manual step when there is a fallout. So if your pre-check criteria does not match, it's now going to either create a ticket or notify somebody to say, please approve or revert, right? So let's go take a look at the flow again. Look at the decision task. All right, let's proceed with the flow. You'll notice now we have moved forward. It's going to push the configuration very rapidly, and then it's going to move on over to performing the post check part of this flow. And once the post check is done, again, as part of the entire end-to-end orchestrated process, we're going to update the ServiceNow CRs as well as close the ticket. And once we do that successfully, I'm going to quickly go back to Configuration Manager and show you, and we'll load live configuration again, just to show you that we have successfully added the new VLAN as part of the service request that came through. All right, so let's take a look into this flow. All right, has been completed. And it's performing the post check now. As part of the post check, it's telling me there's a task to be worked, and it's going to show me that it has successfully passed the post check, so I can move this thing forward or I can revert if need to. So going back to the automation, we have successfully completed this subflow designed by your network engineer. And now there's a diff config, right? So let's go take a look at that. Because we took a pre-snapshot and the post-snapshot, you'll notice it also shows on the brand new device that we have successfully now added the VLAN. So at this point, it also gives you some kind of like a comfort point where the engineers can say, this is the right config that we pushed, so I want to proceed, or you want to revert and reject it. In this case, let's go ahead and proceed and go take a look at the larger top level automation where we're now updating the tickets, and we're going to finally broadcast a notification. And at the end of it, we should see another notification for the team members to say we have successfully serviced the customer request around adding a new VRF to the newly added Arista switch. So that way they can attain their goal of accessing certain assets within your on-prem or off-prem network. So right now it's performing the broadcast piece. And let's go take a look at MS notification. And you'll notice in a timely fashion, we were able to successfully provide notification around the service request coming in, but also being completed. And if we go take a look at the flow here, we have successfully, we should successfully close the ticket as well as part of this end-to-end orchestration. So as promised, we're going to quickly go back to the configuration manager. Let's go take a look at the configuration. Let's load it live on this device. And then we'll quickly see that we have successfully now added the VLAN, brand new VLAN 603 and associated an interface with that. So that was basically, the end of our demonstration that kind of shows how customers can leverage a combination of this capabilities within Itential in order to rapidly not only address onboarding the configuration onto your new vendor, but also incorporating that into your wider orchestration that involves, integrating with your ITSM system, your ticketing system, your sources of truth. So that way, at the end of not only onboarding, but also performing some of these day 2 activities, we're keeping every other ancillary system up to date on what's available, what can be utilized, what's decommissioned. So that way, customers can move forward and not be faced with challenges around supply chain. So what we're going to do is quickly go back to the slides and do a quick recap, right? And from a recap perspective, let's quickly chat about what we saw in the demo and what the suggested effective steps are for onboarding a new vendor successfully, but also making sure that you do it in accordance with your existing process. So number one, analyze your current process, just to identify what steps are vendor specific, specifically around, hey, this is a new vendor, Arista, what config I'm going to push on it, and all the other things around it, right? Things that come in your pre-checks, your integration into your sources of truth to actually gather the data. So all these systems actually are not network-facing system. So you want to make sure that you kind of separate that out when you're analyzing your current process. Once you have done that, the second step would be to create a parent automation that addresses your framework. And the framework could be, doesn't matter if it's device onboarding, doesn't matter if it's a day 2 VRF creation request. I want to make sure I create a CR every single time. I want to make sure I follow my change management process around approval for critical changes and bypass the approval for non-critical changes. And then go to your sources of truth to make sure those are being leveraged and updated. And then we talk about, once you have created the parent process, now you can focus on who is the SME within the organization that can bring to the table the templates and the scripts that can be utilized to make changes onto your newly onboarded vendor. In this case, it was Arista, right? So you can go find someone who knows some information about some of these Arista switches. At the same time, a lot of vendors also provide some of these out of box that you can leverage as part of your automation strategy. And finally, when you have that organized, you would now create some of the vendor specific subflows or sub modular automation so you can plug in and plug out as part of your wider orchestration. So we believe these are some of the steps that you can use to effectively onboard new vendors, support existing vendors, but also have flexibility for all the NetOps and DevOps organization that are looking at the best of breed approach. So with that, I'm going to hand off to Morgan.
Karan, that was great. Really enjoyed the demos. I did kind of have a question. The scenario that we've been talking about mostly has been about adding another vendor into the environment.
Yep.
Can we use a similar approach if we wanted to migrate off of one vendor to a different vendor? So like remove the other vendor completely from the environment.
Yes, absolutely, Morgan. And that's why I specifically kind of called out the modular automation around decommissioning. But before you decommission, as part of the migration, what a lot of our customers do is, because they have access and connectivity to your existing vendor, you can actually run a lot of these pre-checks and post-checks commands and get information from those assets and parse the things out that you might need, such as NTP server or what have you, and apply that as part of the templated strategy to your next vendor that you're onboarding, right? So you can absolutely use the same set of tools and methodology to migrate, like actually migrate from, in this case, Cisco to Arista or Cisco to Juniper and vice versa.
Cool. Thank you, Karan. Okay, this is going to conclude our session for today. We really appreciate having the opportunity to present to you. If you have questions about anything we've talked about in the session, you can contact us using the contact information you see on the screen right now. Thanks, and have a great day.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.